All right, so let's talk about how to write a good investigation for your HA. So first we're gonna look at what the rubric requires for the investigation, and then we're gonna look at a really good example of an investigation to basically show you how you can write a good investigation. So the most important point, I think, in this rubric is the evaluation of different perspectives. The investigation argues to a reasoned conclusion that is consistent with the evidence and argument provided. Essentially, what you want to have is two clear sides to your research question, yes or no, to a large extent or to a small extent. Now, it's important that you can find some middle ground here, you can find some gray area, but there very clearly needs to be two sides that you can find a middle to. Or maybe you can't find a middle to, but either way, there needs to be two sides. There needs to be, yes, something did happen, yes, it was successful, or no, something didn't happen, no, it wasn't successful. Next, the rubric wants you the investigation to be clear and coherent and effectively organized. So when you're making your 2 points, when you're making your your yes, or when you're arguing for your first perspective or your second perspective, you need to argue these in an organized way. You need to either state one after the other or mix them in with each other in a way that makes sense. Thirdly, the investigation contains well-developed critical analysis that is focused clearly on the stated question. Evidence from a range of sources is used to effectively support the argument. And so I like to kind of consider this like the commentary in a kind of English AEC style essay, where your commentary is your analysis basically serves to prove why your evidence first serves your assertion, proves your assertion, and then how that proves the perspective that you're arguing. How does your evidence prove one side or the other is what your analysis wants to be doing. All right, so let's now look into this investigation. So first, the student starts off with a good introduction paragraph. When the FDA approved the first oral contraceptive pill in the 1960s, two of the decade's defining moments, the civil rights movement and the second wave feminism, intersected at birth as birth control was tied to claims of Black genocide. Though many women hailed the legislation of the pill a victory, groups like the Black Panthers saw it as furthering centuries of forced sterilization and eugenics policies made to target the Black population. And so what the student has done a really good job of here is basically setting the stage, explaining to the reader the context of this question before they kind of jump into the question itself. And then at the end of their introduction, they provide both perspectives that they're going to be addressing. And I've highlighted perspective 1 in green and highlighted perspective 2 in blue so that we can kind of look at them as we go through this essay. But the first perspective is basically that one side believed that there was a coercion and alleged genocide going on with this birth control, as the student has described earlier in the introduction, and the other side saw potential benefits of contraceptive and fought to protect it. So one side is arguing basically, yes, there was a genocide, and no, there wasn't a genocide. There's two very clear perspectives that the student has done a really good job of laying out here. And then something else the student does, which is not necessary in every investigation, is they have laid out a definition of genocide. If there are some controversial or unclear terms in your question, it's important that the reader understands where you're coming from and what you're going to address. And so what the student does in this paragraph is basically defines genocide very clearly, so that genocide is imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group, and specifically that there has to be a proven intent on the part of the perpetrators for this to be a genocide. And the student makes sure to understand that this is what they are going to be arguing. So then we get into the first body paragraph, and the student does a really good job of first having an assertion that is basically the first reason for perspective 1. Each assertion should be a reason why one of your perspectives is correct. And so this sentence, Ross argues that the fears of Black genocide at the hands of the government had historical precedent in the policies of forced sterilization and eugenics, is the first reason why the student argues perspective 1 is correct, which is that there's historical precedent. The student then goes throughout this paragraph, states the evidence, which I've highlighted in yellow, and then the analysis here relates the evidence back to the assertion, and thus back to the perspective at large. And so the student does a really good job at the end here of basically analyzing how all the information that they have provided thus far in the paragraph, that there was this historic sterilization, that over 70,000 people were involuntarily sterilized in the past, and that welfare benefits provided new methods of sterilization, and that Black people constituted 23% of these sterilized. All this evidence kind of goes into this last big set of analysis, explaining why all this evidence proves the thesis, which is which proves the perspective one, that there was a genocide. The student goes, the eugenics policies had an intent on the behalf of the government to limit the Black population through the abuse of contraceptive practices. This historical precedent leads historians like Ross and Kluchin to believe that since the U.S. used contraception to commit genocide in the past, the claims of genocide in the 1960s were justified. And so this is going back into the evidence and explaining how this relates to the assertion of historical precedent, and thus why that proves perspective one, that there was a genocide. And so in the second body paragraph, the student provides the second reason that perspective one is correct, that it targeted Black communities through the assertion the targeting of African Americans shifted as new forms of contraception were popularized, perpetuating ideas of Black genocide into the 60s. And the student goes on providing evidence and then using their analysis to connect the evidence back to the initial assertion. And so through these two body paragraphs, the student has provided two reasons why there may have been a genocide, through precedent, historical precedent, and through the targeting of Black communities. Then the student introduces the second perspective, that there wasn't a genocide, through kind of contradicting some of the first perspective. And so this provides an interesting example of different ways that you could organize your paragraphs. So you can either provide paragraphs that include just one perspective and arguing for just one perspective and have them go back to back, or you can include a mix of that and this paragraph where the student introduces their second perspective. The student introduces their second perspective through contradicting the first perspective. So the student, the assertion of this this paragraph introducing the second perspective is, however, proving the government's intentions involves specific actions that purposefully limited the African American race. And so the second reason, the first reason why the student believes perspective two is correct, that there wasn't a genocide, is because there was a lack of intent. And that's what the student is addressing in this paragraph. And so it goes on, during this time, punitive sterilization bills were introduced around the country. None explicitly went against the 14th Amendment, but they still affected Blacks an inordinate amount. And so the student is providing both kind of perspectives back to back, that while they weren't against the law and they weren't explicitly targeting African Americans, they still affected Blacks an inordinate amount. And so that the student demonstrates that while the bills may have affected Blacks an inordinate amount, they weren't. It may not have been purposeful, and thus it may not have been a genocide. And so then the student then goes into again providing evidence and then providing analysis. So the first evidence: the bills tended to target welfare recipients, and since the number of Blacks on welfare was disproportionately large, an involuntary sterilization requirement would disproportionately affect African Americans. Limiting welfare allowed lawmakers to direct their efforts to Blacks without violating any laws. So this evidence is then analyzed as, although it didn't violate any laws, it did target African Americans, which proves the first perspective. However, the student then goes further, providing more evidence. Some public officials abused public assistance by coercing women into sterilization under the threat of revoking their welfare payments. In the 1950s and 60s, U.S. policymakers used the idea of controlling population growth to justify dissemination of birth control internationally and in domestic policies to reduce population growth rates for poor Blacks in the U.S. And so this is more evidence for the first perspective, and the student acknowledges that justification for that it was justification for fears of Black genocide, but still with no explicit genocidal intent on behalf of the government. And so through this paragraph, the student provides a reason why the second perspective is two, by acknowledging the first perspective and providing evidence also, and analyzing that evidence that there was no explicit genocidal intent. And then the student goes on to the second reason that perspective 2 is correct, that there were actually benefits of birth control. And this paragraph is, rather than the first paragraph, which kind of pits one perspective against the other one, this one deals with one perspective on its own. So the assertion sentence introduces the second reason that the perspective 2 is correct, that Weisbord, along with some activists at the time, saw the potential benefits of birth control and thought that it would improve African American lives. So rather than hurting African Americans, birth control actually could improve African Americans and can improve their lives. And so it then begins with more evidence. Martin Luther King Jr. supported birth control, claiming that it was a profoundly important ingredient in the black quest for security and a decent life. And then it analyzes this evidence and explains how it connects back to the assertion and back to the perspective. With birth control, women's rights and reproductive health would improve, infant mortality rates would decrease, and people would be able to alleviate the impoverished conditions imposed by large families. So the student goes and basically explains deeper what the implications of this evidence are, how they relate to positive improving lives of improving the lives of African Americans. And so the student finishes the second paragraph, or analyzing why perspective 2 is correct, by explaining why this leads this one author to believe that the attempts to spread family planning into predominantly Black areas was a way to help those communities. So by connecting all of this, reminding the reader how this all connects to the point that this wasn't a genocide, but this was a way to help the communities, linking back to the initial assertion. So the student then goes on to provide a third reason that perspective 2 is correct, that amongst the staunchest advocates for family planning were Black women. And so the third reason that perspective 2 is correct is that these Black women wanted birth control. And so notice that the student has provided 2 body paragraphs in support of reason 1, in perspective 1, and 3 body paragraphs in support of perspective 2. And so depending on how you want to organize your own investigation, you could have 2 to 3 reasons why perspective 1 is correct, or 2 to 3 reasons why perspective 2 is correct. And you could either pit them against each other like the student did in the paragraph above, or provide each reason in its own separate paragraph, distinct from the other reasons. This is all, there's no formula to do this. This is all personal preference, how your analysis leads you to separate your reasons, and whether one reason is specifically contradicting another reason, or whether they're all separate reasons, and you really just need to weigh the reasons against each other. So the student continues in this one to first provide the assertion, the reason that perspective 2 is correct, and then provides evidence. Some men not only opposed birth control, but believed that women should breed more children to grow the Black population. However, women rejected this role and favored the choice birth control provided. So explaining how women actually favored this, relating this evidence back to the assertion here, providing more evidence then. For them, the pill was not a form of genocide, but the freedom to fight genocide of Black women and children, and fight Black men who still wanted to use and exploit them. And again, the student analyzes this, that although some women opposed the way family planning was enforced, they defended the potential that it had. So again, relating this woman supporting it to the relating all this evidence to the fact that women support this, reminding the reader that this evidence proves that women supported this family planning and didn't see it as a genocide. And then further evidence, according to a 1970 study, 80% of the Black women questioned approved of birth control, and 75% were actually using it. And so through the analysis, the student explains how this expert contends that the steadfast support of those affected most by birth control bolsters the idea that the push for contraception was beneficial, not genocidal. And so the student here is again explaining or going deeper into the evidence and explaining how this evidence links, reminding the reader how this evidence links to the assertion, and thus to the reason that perspective 2 is correct, and basically just adding on to the evidence. And so finally, the reader or the student finishes with this conclusion paragraph, and you'll note the stuff I've highlighted in pink here. This is basically the judgment that the student is making. Throughout these body paragraphs, the student has not made a judgment. The student has simply provided the different perspectives. In green, the student has provided perspective 1. In blue, the student has provided perspective 2. Now, in this final conclusion, the student is basically going to weigh the different perspectives against each other. And so you'll notice there's very little evidence here. The student is basically providing the different perspectives. So first, the student provides perspective 2. Since the 1960s, the claims of genocide have subsided, and the popularity of the birth control pill continues to grow, supporting the historians who rejected the notion of genocide. Perspective 2, that this really wasn't a genocide. Perspective, then putting against perspective 1. However, and however is really this kind of comparison, is a comparison word. And the student uses several comparison words throughout this paragraph to pit them against each other. The long history of injustice and government control and abuse of Black women's reproductive health justified the reason for Black paranoia. Justified that the reasons for Black paranoia were anchored in historical reality. Although, and this is a big comparison word, this allows the student to consider one position against the other and kind of weigh one heavier than the other. Although Ross inclusion's points about the precedent of misusing birth control in the United States did rationalize the paranoia, although perspective 1 and then perspective 2, those instances do not mean that the controversy in the 60s was genocide. The benefits of family planning and the ability to distinguish between forced sterilization and birth control allowed the pill to continue. So notice how the student is basically rehashing what they have said in these body paragraphs. So that's what the conclusion is for. So basically, synthesizing the perspective 1 and synthesizing perspective 2 and pitting them finally against each other, and then judging one as heavier than the other. And so here, although this, the student considers perspective 1, the student judges perspective 2 as more convincing. Then the student continues again, Weisberg and Karen's conclusions that although the implementation of birth control did seem to target the Black community, although perspective 1, there is no provable malicious intent on behalf of the government, perspective 2. And then finally, in the last couple of sentences, the author judges which one is more convincing. And so the student judges that Weisberg and Karen's conclusions are more nuanced and balance both sides of the controversy. And so this is a very clear judgment that the student is making in the conclusion, and only in the conclusion, that one perspective, perspective 2, is more nuanced and balanced. And although some of the policies were questionable, there was no proven intent by the government. Therefore, the birth control campaigns in minority areas in the United States in the 60s were not a form of genocide. And the student finishes with a very clear answer to the original question. And so if we look back at the original research question that the student asked, to what extent were the birth control campaigns in minority areas in the United States in the 1960s a form of genocide? At the very last sentence in this investigation answers this question. The birth control campaigns in minority areas in the United States in the 1960s were not a form of genocide. The student mirrors her previous language in order to clearly state the answer that they have come to in this investigation. And so the last two sentences here make a final judgment. The conclusion paragraph serves to pit one perspective against the other one and explain why one is more valuable, why one is more nuanced and balanced than the other one, why one perspective is ultimately better and more accurate than the other one, and thus answers the question. And so you want to make sure that your conclusion pits both your perspectives against each other, basically sums up the arguments of both your perspectives, compares them to each other, and ultimately explains why one is ultimately superior to the other. And it's not necessary, but it's very useful in the end to basically mirror the language of your research question, like the student does here, to very clearly demonstrate that a position is being taken on this question, and it's not necessary to be as black and white as the student is here. That it was not a form of genocide. The student's research question in this one is pretty black and white. Genocide has a strict definition, and whether or not something meets the definition of a genocide is black and white. Not all research questions will be as black and white. And you might take a position in your investigation that one perspective that there is some gray area, but you always have to answer the question. You always at the end you have to say whether the position is a middle ground. You have to state it at the end of your conclusion. So that is what a good investigation is supposed to look like. If you'd like to look through that investigation, you can find it on our website on tinyurl.com/gcmwriting. tinyurl.com/gcmwriting. Under the resources tab, we have that among several other really good examples here on the website. That some of these examples take their investigation a little bit differently, and so if you'd like to look at some ways you could format a little bit differently, you can look through all of these. And I hope you found this instructional HI video on your investigation useful.